Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. South Carolina kicking off fall camp in about a week. And I know that the majority of conversation around South Carolina heading into 2025 circulates around Lenore Sellers and goes around Dylan Stewart. And look, I ain't faulting the national media for talking about those two cats. There's a very good chance that South Carolina has two top 10 players in the country on their roster heading into 2025. But the consistent conversation that a lot of us have had is we know they have the top end talent. Some of the best players in the whole sport going into 2025. Just how good this South Carolina football team can be in 2025, at least to me, circulates around how complete this football team is, where we're going into fall camp and saying we got position battles pretty much all over this roster heading into 2025. Want to preview and kind of call our shot, if you will, on some of these position battles that we're seeing South Carolina have going into fall camp. We say this all the time. Fall camp is when guys start to separate. It's one thing to practice a couple times in the spring and do a little scrimmage at the end of the spring practice window. It's another thing to practice every single day, being the meeting room every single day. You start to figure out what players we can trust on a day-to-day basis. We're going to see that play out for South Carolina at a lot of different positions on this roster. Fired up to get into it. Before we do, and as always, to the South Carolina fans, let it fly in the comment section. This is no doubt a little bit of a nitty-gritty conversation. Ain't going to be for every South Carolina fan out there, talking nitty-gritty. Hey, who going to be that starting right guard for South Carolina going into 2025? But I think these are really important questions. Let it fly in the comment section. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. It's going to be a really fun team to talk about over the next couple of weeks in fall camp, because there are a lot of position battles up and down this roster. Without further ado, we got to touch on it. And ideally in 2025, this is not really a conversation we need to have. And that is, who is quarterback two. But let's not pretend like this isn't a reality of football. I mean, go look at a team like Penn State. Go look at a team like Notre Dame, team like Georgia. There's been a lot of teams that made runs in the college football playoffs that at some point in the season needed to lean on their quarterback too in really big moments. Ideally, South Carolina's not in that spot. But if they are in that spot, who's the guy? Who's the guy that Shane Beamer trusts? I think he got three guys that are unique for different reasons. Cutter Woods, true freshman, he sounded like he was probably the best quarterback throughout spring practice on this roster outside of Lenore Sellers. I think Air Nolan's probably the most talented, but probably still continuing to get used to this offense coming in through the portal in the winter. And then you have a guy like Luke Doty in terms of, hey, if you're looking for a football player that can provide a similar skill set with his legs that Lenore Sellers gives you, maybe it is a guy like Luke who has played in big moments, the quarterback position for South Carolina. I don't think Shane Beamer knows who the quarterback two is going to be. I'd probably lean Air Nolan, but I really don't know. And it's going to be an interesting conversation to have over the next couple of weeks. And again, regardless, you hope it's not a conversation we need to have in the fall, but it very well might. And you kind of want to know you have a guy that you trust that can come and look. If Lenore Sellers has to go out and get a tape job, miss a possession, who do we trust to take the field and run this offense? Number two, who's the running back one if Rasul Faison can't play? It's really annoying that we still don't know the answer to this, and it's annoying that we have to still have this conversation, but we do. In my opinion, look, if Rasul Faison is clear to play, I think he's your clear running back one. I think he's the bell cow. I think he's a guy that gets 20-plus carries a game for South Carolina. Very similar to what we saw from Rocket Sanders. Now, if Rasul Faison is not eligible to play, I think Oscar Attaway is probably your starting running back, but I think it's going to be a lot more of a committee approach. And if Rasul Faison can't play, and we learn that over the next 2 weeks, I'm looking at Jaron Howell, I'm looking at Matt Fuller and saying, hey, those are those are two young, talented running backs that I think give South Carolina a very high ceiling at the position. Those are two guys that I all of a sudden am monitoring very closely. In an ideal world, it's Rasul Faison playing 80% of the snaps, getting spelled by a guy like Oscar Attaway. My thing with Oscar Attaway is, look, I think he's really solid. I don't know if he's ever going to be an elite running back for South Carolina. Are there other young cats on this roster that can step up and give South Carolina a higher ceiling at the running back position? Again, that's the only time we're having that conversation is if we learn that Rasul Faison can't play for South Carolina. If Rasul Faison can't play, that whole conversation was mute. I think he is by far the running back one on this roster. I think he might be one of the best running backs in the SEC. Number three, two different questions in the wide receiver room. Number one, who is your wide receiver one? Right? Who is the guy that is replacing what Joshua Simon was for Lenore Sellers last year? I think everybody's pick would be Nick Harbor. It probably would be mine as well. The other conversation is, hey, what's the wide receiver rotation look like in general? Where against Virginia Tech week 1, I would probably expect it to be Nick Harbor, Jared Brown, and Mazio Bennett. I think that could change throughout the 2025 season. I think you're going to have a couple of these freshman wide receivers continue to put it together and probably become a little bit more factors in the rotation. That to me is the ideal situation. Kind of similar to how we talked about at the running back spot. Look, I think Jared Brown's really, really solid. I don't think he's a first team all SEC guy. From what we heard about a guy like Brian Rowe or from a guy like Malik Clark, what we think Donovan Murph might be coming in and rolling in the summer, those are the wide receivers that when you close your eyes and envision South Carolina's ideal passing attack in 2025, it probably includes a couple of these true freshmen really standing out. And like we've said all summer long, this is a position where it's easier to play early in your career. You don't have to be a grown man yet to succeed in the SEC. Go look at a guy like Ryan Williams at Alabama. Ryan Williams, buck 70 as a true freshman for Alabama, was one of, if not the best pass catchers in the conference. Can that be Brian Rowe? Or can that be a guy like Malik Clark? The wide receiver rotation game 1 is probably going to go to the veterans. The wide receiver rotation week 5, I think you'll see a lot of freshmen playing a lot of football for South Carolina. How about number 4, tight end? Like, is Mike Smith that true tight end one? Probably the player that I wish we got to see the most in spring, dealing with an injury, getting that cleaned up. In fall camp, can Mike Smith go to a guy that, 12 months ago, the amount of buzz that we were hearing around Mike Smith was a lot, right? Didn't play as much as we expected. I think that had a little bit more to do with, hey, Joshua Simon was just really damn good. Can Mike Smith really win that tight end one job and be on the field 90% of snaps for South Carolina? On the offensive line, I think you got 3 positions. This is what sets South Carolina apart. I've been banging the table for this all off season long. I think this is the deepest and it's the most talented offensive line that Shane Beamer has had at South Carolina. And I get it's a little bit of like, I want to see it before I believe it. And I get I get the South Carolina fans who are taking that approach. I don't think they've had the personnel like this before under Shane Beamer. You are really talented. You are really deep. You have some young talent and some transfer portal guys. I think 3 out of your 5 starting offensive linemen going into fall camp. Josiah Thompson at left tackle, Kason Henry at right tackle, 2 cats that I thought played really well in the month of November. It sounds like Boaz Stanley from Troy has come in and just won that starting center position. Now you're talking about, hey, who are your 2 starting guards? I think you're going to see Tree Babalede versus Nick Sharp, and I think you're going to see Trevon Baugh versus Rodney Newsom. Who wins those jobs? And very similar to how we talked about the pass catchers, I close my eyes and I envision what does the best starting 5 look like. I think it's with Tree at left guard. I think it's with Trevon Baugh right guard. And look, that's not a shot at Nick Sharp. Many of y'all know I'm a Wake Forest alum. I've spent more time than I would like to admit watching Wake Forest football the last couple of years. Nick Sharp can play in the SEC. Again, I don't think he's going to be a first team all SEC offensive lineman, but he's a very reliable body that can play. So I think you have a really high floor with guys like Nick Sharp and Rodney Newsom. My question is, how high can that ceiling be? I mean, I look at Tree Babalade and say, this dude could be an absolute ass kicker in the middle. When you ask him to play tackle, you're putting him in space a little bit more, struggled at times. I still think he can be a really good left tackle if South Carolina needs him to be, but I think he's much better situated to play at guard in a phone booth. Just like let him go maul people, let him get his hands on people in condensed area. I think that's probably your best starting five. Here's the thing that sets it apart, though. There's been years for South Carolina where I don't even think they trusted their starting five. I think you got 8 guys that you trust to play for South Carolina going into 2025. Depth on the offensive line, it separates teams, especially when you want to be a college football playoff caliber team, when you want to win games in November. Chances are you're not going to have the same starting five play every single week of the season. You're going to have to access your depth. When you have 8, 9 guys that you trust to play, that's how you make runs to the playoffs. And I think South Carolina has that going into 2025. This is, in my opinion, the most underrated aspect about this South Carolina football team is what I think they can be up front on the offensive line and how well I think they're going to be able to run the football on a consistent basis. Because you go back to 2024, I think there was a little bit of a misconception in terms of how well South Carolina ran the football, especially early in the year. Like, I don't think it was an elite rushing attack by any means. I think a lot of the rushing production came from Lenore Sells putting on that Superman cape and scrambling around and getting it done. I think South Carolina routinely will be able to run the football a little bit more consistently in 2025. Biggest question, at least in my opinion, for South Carolina going into 2025 is this defensive line rotation. And here's the conversation I want to have is, who are your best four on the inside of the defensive line? Because those best four guys probably gonna have to play 35 plus snaps a game. I think it's Nick Barrett and Montel Goodwin, two guys that again, I don't know if they'll be all SEC guys. I don't think you're gonna have a TJ Sanders in that group, but can they be just solid dudes up front that can play? I hate to frame it like this, but the best way to maybe frame it is like, can we just not be liabilities up front, right? I don't think we're gonna wreck games with our interior defensive linemen like we did last year. I think a lot of that production is gonna have to come from Dylan Stewart and Brian Thomas on the edge. But can we be solid, especially against the run? How often can we create those third and long situations where we can ask Dylan Stewart and we can ask Brian Thomas to pin the ears back and get after the quarterback? The most important player to watch, at least in my opinion, is Georgia Southern transfer Troy Pikes. This was a monster win for South Carolina in the spring portal. There were not many good interior defensive linemen that popped into the portal. I think Troy Pikes might have been the best one, arguably a top 3 one. Getting him to South Carolina was massive. How good is he going to be in the SEC? That's a big jump from the G5 to the SEC level. I thought this kid was really dang good last year. Can he translate that going into year 3 of his career in the SEC? If you get a very solid football player in Troy Pikes, kind of changes how you view this South Carolina defense, because you make no mistake about it. That's the question we have. We don't know if we got 4 guys we can trust up front. That's the position we're looking at the most during fall camp. Out on the edge, I mean, Dylan Stewart, Brian Thomas, they're going to play a lot of football. They're probably playing 80% of your snaps on the defensive side of the football. Now, who are the guys that we trust in the 2 deep? Is Desmond you ready in year 3 to kind of take that jump? What do some of the transfers look like? A guy like Jatius Greer, what's he look like? Obviously, Jalen Brown is dealing with some injuries. We'll see when he gets back. Who are your 3 and 4 edge defenders? Probably the question you want to see get answered in fall camp. Linebacker position. I think we kind of know. Fred Johnson and Sean Murphy. Fred Johnson was probably the leader in the clubhouse entering spring practice to win a linebacker job. We haven't heard anything to kind of move us off that idea. Sean Murphy sounds like he's getting the most amount of buzz out of any of the transfer portal additions South Carolina made. I'll say this: Fred Johnson, Sean Murphy, the two blue chip linebackers out of high school, and blue chips for a reason. They're good athletes. Can they be linebackers that we trust? And then we're gonna get nitty gritty here. All right, secondary puzzle. This should be a really good unit, but there's a lot of different ways it could look. Do you want to take the approach of, hey, we want to get our best five on the football field? Because if you do, there was buzz around, hey, Jalen Kilgore, who's been an awesome nickel defender for South Carolina, there was buzz that, hey, maybe you move Peyton Williams to the two deep. Maybe you put Jalen Kilgore at safety, and then you put Brandon Sissy, we're going on the fly here, to nickel, and then Vakari Swain plays that boundary cornerback. I'm not sure if South Carolina would do this. We heard buzz about Jalen Kilgore maybe moving to the safety position. This might be your best five. Like, if you want to get your best five football players in the defensive backfield at the same time, this is probably what it looks like. Now, is that unfair to a player like Peyton Williams? I feel like many of us are taking the approach that Peyton Williams can't play because we haven't seen him play. It's like, look, he's been behind DQ Smith and Nick Emanari, like two of the better safeties that we've seen in the SEC over the last couple of years. I think the blind assumption that Peyton Williams is not a good football player, I think that might be a little bit misguided. But we know Brandon Sissy can play nickel, and we know that might be the ideal position for Brandon Sissy for South Carolina. Well, if you want to get him at nickel, move Jalen Kilgore back to safety, you very well could do that. Now, the question is, do you want to start messing around with Jalen Kilgore? He's one of your best football players on your team. He's been playing nickel for the last 2 years. Do we want to all of a sudden start shuffling the deck there? I don't know. We'll see. I think there's going to be, at the very least, this is the conversation you got to have is we got a lot of good football players in the back end. How can we get them all on the field at the same time? If it's this, maybe we'll see that from South Carolina. Definitely something to monitor in the secondary. I don't know if I explained that as well as I maybe could have, but that's another thing I'm looking at for South Carolina. We'll see how it plays out. It's going to be a really fun team to talk about and monitor during fall camp. There's a lot of red. There's a lot of new faces coming in. We got to replace a lot of good football players. My general take is I think the offense takes a big step. I think the defense probably takes a step back. The question, if South Carolina is a college football playoff team, how big is the step back for South Carolina on defense? All right, we'll close it out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. A lot to talk about over the next couple of weeks. We'll talk to y'all later. Peace.